Okay, welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week we are talking about retirement. So, what does it mean to retire, and to what extent does the concept of retirement make sense in a world with basic income or in a world where people are not necessarily expected to work their whole lives? So, some of us read an article from The Nation from March of this year entitled Economic Insecurity is Becoming the New Hallmark of Old Age. And the article is by Katherine S. Newman and Rebecca Hayes Jacobs. So I want to start by going around the room, and people on the live stream can chime in too. What's your sense of, the culture of retirement in our society and how something like basic income might shift that culture?
Yep. So I guess one interesting aspect that you made me think about is I feel like vaguely my sense is that originally retirement just had to do with when you couldn't work anymore. And then people were living longer and healthier, so we sort of added this period of time that's a little bit like having a basic income for a lot of people, where they're still healthy and able to do things, but they just don't work, and they kind of enjoy that time with other things that they want to do. So I guess one aspect of basic income might be kind of extending that for a lot of people. Also because within that, some people do work like part-time or they do like volunteer stuff, so it's maybe not like so different. I think the period of time where you're really not doing well and like can't really do as much activity will always feel different to people. But this sort of healthy retirement part might feel like it's similar to other stages of life, and more similar at least.
Yeah.
Than right now, where it's like this stark distinction between like you're working and then you're not.
Yeah. Steve?
I had decided that regular people can't possibly save enough during their working life to actually afford a comfortable retirement. I was estimating that a retired person needs, on average, about $500,000 in income and medical care combined, and that hardly anybody can actually save that up by the time they retire.
Good question.
The thing that jumps out to me is the big impact it would have is that it would allow people to kind of go in and out of retirement whenever they wanted, maybe, depending on the level, of course. But I think that would be, I guess maybe that isn't what we mean when we say retirement, but it would kind of blur the boundary between retirement and just going in and out of the workforce.
Yeah. Richard?
Well, Thomas Paine wanted sort of a basic income when we started when they're 50, because that's when people, didn't live that long. So we went for like 150 years after that period without any sort of concept of a basic income or for the elderly. And then in the 30s, we started Social Security because people were really, the elderly were really poor, and they didn't have many people to take care of them and things like that. And in other countries, they have defined pensions, and pensions provided by the government that everyone receives the same amount of money. Well, in the U.S., you have to contribute each quarter or some blasted thing like that. So people get from $700 to $1,800, and that's a wide disparity. So with a basic income, they would, sort of equalize that. But still, the $1,800 would become $2,800. So still,
If you have a $1,000 a month basic income.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's really interesting because the concept of retirement itself implies that people should normally work for most of their life and then get to a point where they don't have to work anymore, and they're retired and they're free to kind of spend their time how they want. And then there's also the interesting expectation that people save for retirement. Either by saving up personal savings or putting money into retirement accounts. Pensions, are a form of this. Social Security is even a form of this. It's a form of forced saving for retirement, right? And when you think about it, what are we saving for when we're saving for retirement? We're saving so that once we're retired, once we're not working anymore, we have a steady source of income, to supply us with spending money so we can participate in the market and, buy the things we want and need and that kind of stuff. And basic income provides that. When people are saving for retirement, they are saving to be able to have something similar to a basic income when they're not working anymore. So the idea that retirement is something you have to save for, I think, is something that basic income could really, really disrupt. And it's not necessarily an efficient thing to do to kind of like say, okay, people, you've got to set aside some amount of money for later, or we're going to have, we're going to automatically set aside some of your money for later, when you can just give them the money later anyway through a basic income, and give them money now too, right? I feel like that can be a big shift in how we approach retirement.
And also with Social Security, if you die before you're 65, or you don't live that long after you're 65, you don't get any of the money back that you put in. And, well, if you have a 401k, then you can give it to one of your children or something.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the first option is or the first example is more similar to basic income. If you die, you're not going to get a basic income. Mm-hmm. You can't just be like, oh, everyone's expected to live to 100, and if you die before you get that the rest of your basic income, you can pass it on to your kids or something like that. And I think that probably makes more sense. Obviously, if you want to pass things on, if you want to pass money and wealth on to your kids, you can still save that up during your life, that kind of thing. But it also might, it's an interesting point, because we might not think of that as something that's so important either, if you know that your descendants are all going to get basic income as well. So Mitchell says, currently retirement is in most cases tied to your income throughout your working career. The income of pensions and Social Security is tied to how much you put into it. Yep. So I think that's a really good point. When Social Security was created, and kind of to this day, it's a system that's designed to prevent people from becoming poor in retirement. It's not designed to help people who are already poor per se. It only helps the people who actually figured out a way to earn money during their, the prime of their life, that kind of thing.
When it started, the people who were already in retirement age didn't put anything into it, and they received more generous benefits than those who came after them.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too. So it's, there's a lot of, when we design these pension systems, we're still thinking of people as workers and deserving some benefit based on kind of how much they contributed and stuff like that. But that's not necessarily the most efficient way to distribute money. Just like it's not necessarily the most efficient way to, create jobs for people and find out a way to make it seem like they're contributing something, that kind of thing. Yeah. So my mom says, yes, retirement isn't what it used to be because of longer life, healthier, etc. It's interesting that the whole premise is based on what you deserve because of your contributions, scaled to how much you made, in fact, when UBI would not have those conditions. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's right. And if we think about, paying people based on what they deserve, our sense of what people deserve, the reason why we have that sense that some people deserve more money for contributing more is to provide a social incentive to contribute. But if you have, market incentives, if you pay people to do the work, you don't really need those social incentives anymore, and they can kind of maybe get in the way of what's efficient. Yeah.
Your mom also agrees that it kind of helps the people who worked, but not the people who didn't.
Right. So so that's more of like, okay, now we're providing this incentive to work, and to what extent is that useful, beneficial to get everyone to kind of contribute or set things up so that people can feel like they contributed, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on the savings thing that you were talking about, because first of all, it's a really hard thing that we're always trying to get people to do, that's difficult because it's such a long discounting problem of you get the benefits so far, and there's so much uncertainty about how long you're going to live and how the stock market's going to do and all of that. So it's not the most intuitive, ideal system. Obviously, this is kind of more for the wealthy who are supposed to be saving on top of Social Security.
Right.
But even for them, it's the upper middle class wealthy, it's not the really wealthy, but whatever that group is, where they're really emphasize that they have to save in this way. First of all, it's not that easy to do, like you pointed out, and that's what economists are always talking about, that like people quote unquote aren't saving enough.
Right.
And they do that based on a calculation of kind of how the money is going to grow, assuming a certain kind of rate of return across the stock market. And so they kind of treat that as fact. So it's kind of interesting to intersect that with some of your ideas about how basic income would affect like the financial sector, because there's kind of an assumption that the financial sector is going to be a certain way across enough time. At least it's going to average to a certain kind of return, and that a lot of people are kind of relying on that for what they expect in retirement. And probably the Fed or whatever tries to keep it that way too. So it cycles back.
That's exactly
itself.
right. If we're expecting people to earn money through investments in the financial sector, in the financial markets, whether that's stocks or bonds or anything like that, that creates an incentive for our institutions to make good on that expectation.
Right.
So now there's an incentive for our economic policy to make sure the stock market is kind of going up over time. Make sure, people are going to be able to get good returns from the bond market, that kind of thing. Yeah. Richard, go ahead.
For the past few years, since a new law came into effect, you're allowed to invest in companies directly. Then I've been in my direction my brother to invest in these through like WeFunder and Fig, where my brother invested into a brewery and he receives 20% interest for like 3 years or something like that. And I invested into a number of games, and my first dividend came out this past May, and I received 191% of my initial investment. I still have a few more years left on it.
That's great.
So you can do things like that as well.
Yeah. So, there's always going to be opportunities to invest. And I think the question is, and those are great returns. Congratulations to you and your brother. There are always going to be ways to invest. And the question is whether we want, as a society, to set things up so that people have to invest in order to be able to get the retirement they need, or have the passive income they need when they're not working, and that kind of thing. And it feels to me like that is making things overly complicated.
Yeah, it definitely makes things complicated. And I guess it wouldn't totally go away, like Richard's pointing out. Like, in addition to whatever basic income you have, like people are always going to be trying to make some extra money and make it over time. And I think that's good. And we've talked about wanting a certain amount of investment in the companies in the first place.
Yes.
But to have it be something that people are basically relying on, like if you're in a certain economic bracket, like you have some Social Security, but to like keep your house and live where you live and whatever, you're kind of expecting retirement returns to be a certain way. So,
and if you're forcing people to invest now so they can get money out later, it's kind of like, well, what's the point? Why not just give them the money later if we have the capacity to do that, and then make sure you set up the economy so that it has the available resources so they can spend the money later on when you give it to them, that kind of thing.
I guess the argument someone would make, that you might disagree with, would be like, oh, well, you're actually making the economy of the future more productive and more able to provide them with things because they're investing in companies now that are going to grow and are going to be productive later on.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made for having a certain level of private sector investment in order for companies to be able to form and take risks and that kind of thing. But there's no reason why that should happen to line up with, the amount of money that people need from passive incomes and that kind of stuff. So I would say that it would be useful, kind of like how we talk about decoupling work from income. I think it's useful to kind of decouple investment from income, even though people still get some income from work and people still get some income from investment. We would want that to be more about the incentive to contribute labor or the incentive to invest, right? I think that's probably the right way to look at it. So Phoenix Congress on the live stream says, if UBI was paid for in part by a VAT, would that be unfair to people who saved for retirement but then lost purchasing power?
Interesting question.
So I think the underlying assumption here is that if we have a VAT, it would reduce the purchasing power of existing money. So I'm not quite on board with that assumption. Like, I don't necessarily agree that would happen with the VAT. We actually had a whole Boston Basic Income on discussing the VAT and the effects of the VAT and what that would do. So you might want to check that out.
Yeah, just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, it was just a few weeks ago. Yeah, and generally speaking, at least when I think about UBI, I think about what makes it possible is whether the economy has room for the spending. So whether there's something for people to buy with the money. It's less about whether you happen to match it up with taxes or not. So I don't think it's, like we talk, when we see Andrew Yang, we talk about, the VAT funding the UBI. And I think it's true that he wants a UBI and he also wants a VAT. But I don't think it's accurate to necessarily say that the VAT funds the UBI.
And you have to spend $120,000 a year to go through your UBI that you receive anyway.
That's only if you assume that consumer prices are going to go up by 10% or something like that.
It looks like Phoenix did watch
So
that.
that's great that you watched the VAT episode. Cool.
Do you remember what we said about in there that would relate to?
Well, that certainly, it creates a wedge between input prices and output prices, but whether the output prices, i.e. the consumer prices, actually go up or change, the price level changes or something like that, that's going to depend on economic policy, like monetary policy and stuff like that. So my mom says not everyone understands how to invest, even if they have some extra money to do that.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, this is part of the problem, right? So because of that, we've created these systems that kind of force people to invest. So Social Security, 401k, investment accounts, that kind of thing, kind of make it easier for people so that they don't have to think about how to do it properly. And that's one way to go. But an easier way to go is just to say, wait a minute, you don't have to invest. We're going to provide you a passive income. And that's what basic income does. And then people can decide whether they want to work or not at any point in their life. And I think this is the point that Nick was bringing up, that, it doesn't have to be you put in your time and then you get to retire. It can be at any given time. You can decide whether you want to earn more money on top of the basic income that you already get or not. Yeah. Right? So my mom also says UBI for all and Medicare for all seem like the simplest and best solution. Yeah, so I think that's true. There are a lot of things that the government should pay for. There are resources that are most efficiently allocated by the government. And then the basic income is for the resources that are more efficiently allocated by the market. Yeah. Yeah.
I had another point. What was it going to be? Oh, in terms of like retirement and saving, I wonder if people would still need extra, either like Social Security or extra basic income or saving for the period of time when they're really unable to do work or really won't want to. And I guess I say this because it kind of depends on the level of basic income and the amount of income that people are actually earning from work. You could imagine still that there was a predictable period in your life where you're thinking, okay, like the 30% of my income that I currently get from wages is not going to be there. So that might still be something that people want to save for, or that we wanted to have a government policy like sort of upping the basic income around or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I wanted to raise that.
So I think kind of what you're bringing up is, does it make sense to provide more resources for older people than younger people?
Like from the government, basically.
Or just in general.
Yeah, in
general.
Right.
Because, old people obviously, need more medical care, that kind of thing. Or in order to have kind of the same quality of life as younger people or comparable, they're going to need more resources going to them. So this is, we have to make a trade-off, right? The economy has finite resources available to it. So we can say we want to set the UBI to the maximum possible level, and then everyone gets the same amount. And then the question is, okay, but now old people are getting the same amount as young people. Do we want to lower the basic income and then provide more cash to older people? Or do we do it through, socialized healthcare that naturally, even if everyone gets the same healthcare benefits, older people are going to be making more use of that. And by increasing those benefits, it decreases the amount of basic income we can afford, that kind of thing. Right. So you have to make these trade-offs, right? Because if you just decide that every person, no matter how old they gets the maximum amount of medical care and life-saving stuff, then we'll suck up all our resources.
No, I understand. Yeah. But let me add something to that, and then I do want to go to Richard, which is like, I guess part of the question is like, you could give everybody the maximum basic income, and then those who like anticipate that they're going to stop working or this or that, or think they're going to live longer, can save more for themselves. So there's like pros and cons to that I wanted, like that would be the like, if you take two alternatives, let's take medical care out of it for a minute, but just for like potentially you might be working less or have increased other expenses. Like one alternative is that the basic income is higher over the course of your whole life, and you get to decide if you want to save more of that for the future.
Sure.
Another is that the basic income is lower earlier in your life, and then the government gives you more when you're older.
Right.
And those could be kind of economically equivalent, but they have some important differences. And I think they have different pros and cons. It's not obvious to me which is better. Because on the one hand, like we said, having to plan, having to save ahead that far, that can be hard. On the other hand, individuals know things about themselves. So sometimes it's good to let individuals decide how they want to allocate their money across the lifespan themselves. So I guess it just seems like one of these classic questions to me about like, basically, should the government handle this kind of forced saving for you in a way? Or should it let you do it?
Yeah, and I think you're right that in a lot of ways they're economically equivalent if you can expect that people will save intelligently and
right,
like
which
that
is a
kind
question,
of thing.
right? Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if the basic income is high, or if the basic income is higher and we're expecting people to save and they do save, that's equivalent to the basic income being lower and them taking more money out of savings later.
Right.
So my intuition is that it's always going to be a combination of both. That to some extent we are going to want to provide more resources to older people who need to have access to more of those resources, but then people also might want to save on top of that. So my intuition is that's going to be somewhere in between. Yeah. Richard, go ahead.
And there's futurists who say that with maybe a cocktail of like pharmaceuticals, genetic engineering, and nanomachines, or nanobots, or nanites, or whatever you want to call them, that people can potentially live forever or live much longer without, needing to retire or things like that.
Yeah, so if people can kind of stay young forever, then this issue kind of goes away because older people aren't necessarily going to need more resources than younger people.
Ones,
so it's just the same basic income forever. And then you have questions about like, okay, now are people still having children? Is the population going to get too big? That kind of thing.
Different questions,
Yeah, so all interesting questions. So let's see. So my mom says, I think not being able to work, should there still be disability? Disability could still be provided even with UBI. And I think most people understand about using their house as the main investment, but the housing market makes that problematical too.
Yeah.
So the first part about should there still be disability payments?
That's interesting.
So that's an interesting question. Yeah. I think, it depends. Certainly, there's nothing about basic income that precludes paying people disability payments if they're disabled. But the idea of paying disability payments implies that people should be able to earn money from work, and these people are simply not able to do that. I think what the smartest thing to do is probably to implement the basic income and get it to the highest level the economy can sustain, and then look around at some of these other programs and see if we still need them, or to what extent we still need them.
Because I feel like it would depend on what percentage of their income most people are getting from work, like how relevant it was, don't you think?
Yeah. I mean that could be part of it. I mean, I think more broadly speaking, there are some. So like I was saying, there are some resources that are most efficiently allocated by the government, and then we can look around and see which resources are being allocated by the government and whether it still makes sense under a basic income. And that could factor into deciding whether we have disability support or not. I mean, I think that's right, because you might still be in an economy where we need non-disabled people to we need the incentive for non-disabled people to work to be high enough, but we don't want to punish the disabled people at the same time. And we do have the resources to support disabled people. So you could end up in a situation like that. Yeah.
And there's also other side issues with this, which is like, would you want to keep the requirement that if you're on disability, you can't do certain amounts of work or over, because there's all those like, potential inefficiencies too.
My guess is that no matter what, you kind of don't want to have those requirements.
Right.
My guess is that. So my feeling is that the ideal disability system would be that you had some way of demonstrating that you had some kind of deficiency that meant you couldn't earn an income from work, or you're less likely to be able to earn as much of an income from work.
Right.
But then even after you have the disability payment, you figured out a way to do that. It shouldn't take away the disability payment. Because
then you're just stopping people from doing productive
Because then you're it's not efficient. Yeah.
I think it might allow shifting over to an approach that's more like what you're describing for older people. Mm-hmm. Like, instead of evaluating, is this person sort of, because of an accident of fate, being deprived of like the right to work and earn an income, and we're going to
Yeah.
make up for that. It's more like deciding who needs more resources
Right.
because of their disability.
Yeah. That's kind of
Yeah.
how I was thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We can think of old age almost as a form of disability.
Yeah. I was thinking
Yeah.
that too when the comment came up with
Yeah.
your mom on the yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, and I think the answer is the same for both. That it's going to depend on how strong we need the incentives for able-bodied people to contribute their labor. So if we don't need those incentives to be so strong that the income is such that it kind of deprives them of being able to live a decent life, then we probably don't need to pay extra money to old people or extra money to disabled people.
Because it's not going to make that much difference.
Because it's not going to make that much difference. And then, people even who are able-bodied can opt to stay out of the workforce too, and then they'd be kind of on par with, older people who can't really work or disabled people, that kind of thing. Go ahead,
There's
Richard.
actually a study where they had a young person who was like 18 wear these like goggles that represented like cataracts, and he said weights on them and things like that, so that they couldn't move and whatnot. So they had a more of an appreciation of how the elderly felt.
So people feel how it's like to be an old person. Yeah. I just got 10,000 steps, by the way.
Nice job.
Yeah.
I see that you're, walking a lot.
Right now.
Yeah,
Right
yeah.
now. Yeah.
It's not a perfect algorithm.
Yeah.
And kind of when your mom brought that up, I was thinking like it's possible, I'd have to think more about it, that instead of having two separate evaluations, one based on old age and one based on disability, you could have the disability one could also cover old age, because what we really care about, if we care about it at all, is like people being unable to do as many things. So that might be more sensitive to the underlying variable that we care about than your actual numerical.
So I think in some sense, old age is a proxy for not being able to contribute as much work anymore.
Exactly.
But it's also a proxy for maybe you've lived this life and contributed your share and are all done.
Well, that's kind of what your mom's saying too. And I think that's kind of what it's evolved into more. Like I said, with like the healthier retirement years, and people are like, oh, now you deserve to like not be working all the time because you already did.
Right.
It's just kind of the norm that we have now.
Right.
It's kind of arbitrary in a way. Like when is the age that you've worked enough that you deserve to like, not have to work anymore, but we've kind of decided that.
Police can retire after 20 years.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And society agrees that it's a tough job, and so after 20 years.
Yeah.
Factory workers, you could retire after 30 years.
Yeah.
Which meant that some of them were retiring when they were like 46.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was thought to be, you've done your service.
Yeah.
And you get to retire with a big factory pension.
Yeah.
So it's sort of
different for different professions.
46, 65, 70,
yeah.
sort of arbitrary.
That's interesting.
But of course, this is only possible if we in general, don't need people to be contributing labor and pulling their own kind of weight in the labor market. If it's like, if we can actually sustain that. So the fact that this kind of thing is possible is part of what suggests that something like a basic income is possible too.
Because it's like we're able to afford that.
Yeah, we don't need it to be. We don't need the market incentives to be such that everyone's kind of contributing labor during their whole life in order to support.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And like we've seen that with people retiring with being healthy for longer in their retirement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So and in terms of people using their house as the main investment, this
that's a good point.
like this is a big.
Mortgages.
Mm-hmm.
This is a big part of how people kind of save for retirement or invest for retirement.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly damaging to the housing market. It makes houses more expensive. So it's harder for people. It makes it harder for people who don't have houses to get houses. Makes housing more expensive. It makes it so that we have housing crisis like we saw in 2008 because everyone's expecting the housing prices to go up and up and up as part of their investment, and then we create economic policy that facilitates that, and then it becomes unstable, and then it crashes. Right. So if we
like a land value tax.
Yeah, so to the extent, so a land value tax can kind of help with this incentive, but also a basic income can help with this. Because if you have a higher basic income, that allows people to stop thinking of their houses necessarily as investments or needing their houses to be investments.
Yeah.
And then we can adjust our economic policy. I mean, automatically the basic income is going to cause the Fed to raise interest rates, which would make housing cheaper too, because it makes mortgages more expensive.
Yeah.
But it also gives people more freedom to live in different places, which can help take pressure off the housing market.
Yeah.
And all of this stuff can contribute to housing just being cheaper. It's great if houses are cheaper if you're thinking of houses as a place for people to live.
Like
because
you want your car to be cheaper.
You want your car to be
Right.
cheap
So-
because cars are, provide a benefit to you. You want housing to be cheap because housing is a really, having a home is a really important thing, having a roof over your head. So basic income can allow us to stop thinking of houses in this way.
Yeah.
And this certainly ties into the retirement thing as well.
And I think they're also pointing out on the live stream, like there's also an issue, at least as bad, maybe worse than with like sort of overall like investment index funds, which is that like the house might be generally expected to go up, but your specific house may go up a lot more than you expect or a lot less, and it's like very hard to predict. And Alex, who sometimes comes, the other Alex, has mentioned someone to us recently who like, is underwater on their mortgage and so can't retire because they have to keep paying the mortgage. So like the volatility of house prices, it's even less predictable, I think, than like the volatility of the sort of long run stock market. And so it's like difficult as a way to try to be investing in the future with something so unpredictable. It's not really great for the person who owns the house in that way.
Yes.
Because they can't plan very easily.
Yes.
So on. It's not just about the people who don't own the houses. It's also about the ones who do.
Yes.
Like, there's also
a really good
problems
point.
on that side, I think.
Yeah.
With using it as like something you're relying on for later.
Yeah. To the extent that that our society is expecting people to use homes as investments, we're setting ourselves up for problems.
Right.
Yeah.
And like that's also something we're relying on for older people being able to get by, because the idea is that they've paid off their house, so their like living expenses go down.
Right.
We're kind of counting on that because Social Security isn't that high and so on. Anyway.
Yeah.
I also really liked Phoenix's point, if I can Congress on.
Yeah. So Phoenix Congress says, does the public really agree that being a cop is a tough job that deserves retirement after 20 years, or do they just have better negotiators than the rest of us? I think it's probably both. In
any case, it illustrates that retirement age is arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. But I also agree, like, I think, Phoenix, that sometimes what happens is, like, the bargaining power leads to a norm, and then the norm everyone justifies by saying, oh, they deserve it. So, like, I'm kind of with Phoenix on this. Or even if they do think that they deserve it, it might be because they had the bargaining power to negotiate it in the first place, is kind of how I would think about it.
Right.
So I like that point.
Yep.
But I think I also like your point, Steve, like that it's not like, it is a bit arbitrary. It comes out of things like who was able to negotiate a shorter time.
Yep. So my mom says that buying a house provides a passive way of investing. And I think that's right. And I think that's a problem. And I think, basic income can help make it so that people don't need to passively invest anymore. And then, it'll still be possible to invest. And then the kinds of things you invest in are probably not going to be things like houses. They're going to be, businesses that are actually profitable for selling things to actual people and that kind of thing. So the investments would be more aligned with what actually benefits people instead of just sitting on property.
Whereas like housing getting more expensive doesn't really benefit people, is your argument, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of not aligned there. I also think, like, especially when we're talking about older people, Robert says homeownership isn't a cakewalk. And, like, there's a lot of, like, taking care of the house that you have to do yourself. And, I mean, you can pay people to do it, but there's, like, a lot of management of it. So that's also could be a burden for some people.
You can imagine a world in which there are fewer homeowners and, there are more landlords and property owners who rent housing out to the people who need housing. So then you have the specialization of the people who are experts at kind of maintaining the housing and, upkeeping it and that kind of thing. And then they rent out to tenants. And that could be a more efficient, more optimal type of housing market as well.
And there's an issue with absentee landlords and property managers that raise the prices of the mortgages, rents.
Yeah, but if you have something like a basic income and maybe even combined with a land value tax or something like that, then that creates an incentive for the landlords to be competitive, to provide competitive prices, and to also provide a good product for the renters, for the tenants. So that can help kind of keep everything in check. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had a whole housing discussion too, didn't we? Have
Yep.
a meetup on that. So we brought up reasons people would want to own their home too, but so we don't. I mean, there's pros and cons on both sides, but
Yes.
but maybe having to treat it as an investment is a problem either way.
Yeah, I mean, this is mostly to Robert's point about home ownership not being a cakewalk.
Yeah, right,
so
right.
there might be people who bought their homes who ideally wouldn't have wanted to, but they did it because it's an investment and that kind of thing. And there's incentives to own homes that are beyond just having a smart financial situation and that kind of thing. Yeah. So experts at housing equals landlords. Yeah, so you could imagine an economy where the incentives are such that landlords are going to be really good at providing really good, really cheap housing. And right now it's kind of not like that in a lot of places, but it could be if people have more freedom in choosing where to live, if if there are a lot of potential tenants that have money to spend, and the landlords want to make a profit. They have to compete with each other, provide a good product. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the dream.
That's the
Maybe
dream.
like a rent to own thing instead of for furniture or whatever for a house.
Yeah, you could have a setup like that too. I think I'm more speaking to the idea that maybe owning a home is more trouble than it's worth, and you want that part of things to be specialized for experts on property managers, landlords, that kind of thing. People will always have reasons to own their own homes too, but maybe less. Yeah. So what do you guys think about getting to the article?
Sounds good.
All right. Nearly half of all private sector employees in the country, nearly half of all private sector employees in the country, some 58 million people, had no company-sponsored retirement plan in 2018. As recently as 1999, only 39% of retiring workers were in this predicament. The retirement situation in the United States isn't just bad, it's getting worse with each passing year.
I have a question about what is a company-sponsored retirement plan?
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether that meant like the employer's matching some level of the employee contribution,
Right.
I think it's like pension.
or just through work at all.
Yeah, because like for example, if your work like has an automatic policy of taking some money out for you and putting it in, like as a default, putting it in savings, but they're not actually giving you any extra money or matching anything. Does that count
I think that counts.
as a company
I
sponsored
took
thing?
this to include that.
You did, yeah. I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean, it probably does include it because if you think about even companies that have full-on pensions, they're probably balancing that out by paying slightly lower salaries or
Right.
wages or something like
But like
that.
in my situation, I could choose
Yeah.
to have it be zero. Like it is up to me, like that they take the money out or not. They just happen to
Right.
set the default as taking it out, but
Right.
so they're not really doing anything. It doesn't even feel like they're doing. I mean, I understand that economically, maybe they're not really doing anything for you with a pension either because they're
Yes.
just paying you less.
There are also tax incentives.
There are tax incentives, yeah.
If your
That's
company just decides not to sponsor one, then
Right.
you lose access to those tax incentives.
But can't you just do it yourself into like an
the
IRA?
limits are a lot lower.
Oh, are they?
Yeah,
Interesting.
way lower.
Oh, I didn't know that.
From what I understand.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting that this is being framed as a problem. And it's being framed as a problem partly because we have this expectation that that people save for retirement or someone's saving for them for retirement. And we also have this expectation that people are provided for by their employers, right? And, to me, when I look at this, I think, well, gosh, I would want this to be something that the government takes care of, not employers. And that's true of income as well. And that, I would want the labor market to be such that people are only paying workers to provide an incentive for them to work.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it is one of these funny things where we're thinking of a private company as something like
As should the private company should be taking care of the employee, that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. So Phoenix Congress on the live stream says, to the extent that Social Security exists with a UBI, a dividend increase at a certain age, what do you think about tying that age to a percentage of average life expectancy?
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
like compared to just maybe picking a random age kind of and sticking with it.
certainly if you're going to calculate how much Social Security you can afford, and what's going to factor into the age calculation is how long people are expected to live.
Right.
So I think that's already part of the calculation.
But I think maybe part of what Phoenix has in mind is like right now with Social Security, we kind of picked a number and stuck with it for a really long time.
Right.
As life expectancy goes up and maybe down. So maybe if it was reevaluated every so often, that would be more efficient.
Recently, it's gone up to 66 and then 67 in a few years.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And life expectancy has actually been declining a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So indexing it to age inflation. I guess the question is, what's the goal in doing that? I'm not entirely convinced that, once we have a basic income up to the maximum level, that we would need an old age subsidy or not. And then this also brings up the question of, if we do need an old age subsidy, if we want an old age subsidy, should it be starting at a specific age, or is it just that the amount of the basic income gradually increases as you get older, that kind of thing? Because, people don't suddenly become unable to work once they reach a certain age. It's kind of a gradual thing. So it's an interesting question, a kid who's 5 years old maybe gets zero basic income, and, someone who's 82 gets a lot more, and then it's in between, it gradually increases or something like that. It's an interesting question. My intuition is that, it doesn't make sense for little kids to get it, because that creates an incentive for people to have more kids. Because if you give basic income to a kid, what you're really doing is you're giving more income to the parents. Not sure if that's necessarily the way we want to go. And then for old age, I don't know. It's an interesting question.
A COLA sort of thing, cost of living adjustment.
I don't think anything within basic income should be adjusted for cost of living. I think when you start to do that, you run into the problem of potentially hyperinflation. Because now you're saying if inflation brings the cost of living up, you bring the basic income up to a higher level, and then that creates more inflation. So the amount of stuff, there's real constraints on the amount of stuff the economy can produce. So if you're saying we want people to have a certain quality of life, and we're going to adjust the basic income to match that at any time, if that quality of life is more than what the real resources of the economy can sustain, then you just have a hyperinflationary spiral.
Kind of
but that was solved
Venezuelan-ish.
in the 80s by Volcker with increasing interest rates. Then that's what your plan does anyway.
Right. So, but if you're already calibrating the basic income to the maximum level the economy can sustain, and that corresponds with higher interest rates, like Paul Volcker did in the early 80s, then you're already kind of maxed out. You can't say, if the cost of living increases, we increase the basic income further. There's no room to really raise interest rates to cancel it out anymore. It would really be a hyperinflationary problem. Indexing basic income to inflation, or indexing any of this stuff to inflation or cost of living, is a pretty big mistake, I would say. Yeah. If the basic income is low enough that there's plenty of room to raise it anyway, then yeah, you could index it to inflation, but then you're not getting the maximum level of basic income the economy can sustain anyway. And really what we'd want to do is we want to get basic income to the maximum level so people can get the maximum benefit from the economy. And then once you're doing that, there's no indexing to inflation anymore. It's just what can the economy handle.
Another thing that you talked about is I don't know if he had in mind different amounts in different places in the country, or was it maybe it was it was Richard who made this point. But then you don't allow prices to kind of even out across the country. Is another thing.
Right. So if you're doing cost of living adjustments based on location, then that's problematic too, because now you're paying people more to live in more expensive places.
So instead of prices changing.
Social Security has this year is 1.6%, and that's across. It equals everyone across the country. I'm talking about something like that.
I see. So it was more what you were talking about before then. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah.
So I think this is it maybe makes sense if you're calculating the amount of the payout based on some like minimum subsistence level or something like that, and there's plenty of room to raise it because the economy has the resources that people can buy stuff with the money and that kind of thing. Then cost of living adjustments make sense, but the fact that you're not giving people the maximum benefit already, I think, is a mistake. So the only context in which cost of living adjustments make sense is when you're already doing something wrong. Is kind of my intuition. Yeah.
Can I bring up another point? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to get to more of the quotes below about like pensions.
Yeah.
But an interesting downside of using pensions, I think, is that people are less mobile as workers, which I guess could be good in some work situations, but could also be bad in some labor markets.
Mm-hmm.
As in, like, sometimes I think you have to stay at the company for a certain amount of time to get your pension, right?
Yes.
So might be good for that individual company, but it's not necessarily good for the overall labor force if it's more efficient for people to move companies at different times
Right.
as their talents change or the needs for labor change.
It-
So it tends to stick people to where they are.
It creates perverse incentives in the labor
Yeah.
market. Yeah, I think that's right. And Phoenix Congress says, unrelated to retirement, but kids are citizens and should get a fractional share. So I think this is
In
this.
In Canada, they have a child allowance, and I sent you an article. It would have
Right.
child allowances all over the world except for in the U.S.
Yeah, so I think obviously having a child allowance versus not having a child allowance, having the child allowance is better. But if we have a full basic income, I'm not sure that giving it to children is a good way to go. It's less about they're citizens, so they deserve it. I don't think that's the right way to think about basic income. It's not like, okay, you're a citizen, so you've earned this just by virtue of being a citizen. Children are citizens, but the question with basic income is how do we provide the maximum benefit for people? How do we ensure that our society is as prosperous as possible? And I think giving it to kids is probably not the answer. Maybe phasing it in, once they turn 12 and they get the full amount when they're 18, that kind of thing could be good.
Or like an Alaskan permanent fund where everyone receives a certain amount from the amount of oil or something.
Babies get it.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. But I don't think that's the most effective way to distribute the money. And obviously, there are places that are doing things like this, and it's better than not doing anything at all. But the question is, how do you provide the maximum benefit to your society?
So, we had an
Yeah.
interesting one a long time ago. You might not have seen it, Phoenix, on like population growth and basic income and how it might affect population trends or not. Sort of starting from the fact that population growth has actually leveled off, which is kind of a huge miracle for like the planet, and then would we want to make sure our basic income didn't change that, and sort of would it change
Right.
that? And so this was one of the big considerations in thinking about whether to give it to kids, because one of the factors that seems really important to why people are having a more, like on average, about 2 kids across the world is that you can be a bit more economically well off with fewer kids, and so that's
Right.
a pressure that goes against having a lot of kids. And so if you were to change that, the concern might be that it would affect population growth and you'd get exponential growth
Right.
again, and that would be, in the long term, you'd be able to provide less for everybody. So you
Yeah.
may disagree on that, but that's kind of part of where this background is coming from in
If-
terms of
if
thinking
we
about whether to give it to kids.
Right.
Yeah.
If we find ourselves in a situation where population is not growing fast enough or it's shrinking too much and we want to provide an incentive for people to have more children, that's when you would want to start maybe providing basic income to babies and children and stuff like that.
Like in France, they have a weird system where it doesn't start until they have 2 children or more.
Yeah, that's a little bit weird because now you're providing an incentive to have a lot of children rather than a few. But I would generally expect it would make more sense to taper it off after you've had a few children or something like that.
Yeah, that would be
But,
another option. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the question is, what's the outcome that you want? And I think that's that's much more important than trying to make these decisions based on kind of like what you feel people deserve.
Well, I think that
Yeah.
Phoenix sort of clarified in the next comment. Like, I think in terms of ending poverty, we're sort of assuming a basic income that's already at a level that even if you had a few kids, you wouldn't be in poverty. And then we're thinking about this question. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it? Alex?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about like a basic income that's calibrated to the maximum level, you wouldn't imagine that people who have a few kids would be in poverty anymore. The question is whether you would want to reduce that basic income in order to provide additional basic income to the families with children. Again, if the amount of the calibrated basic income is very small to begin with, then you start to get into these questions like about that we have about disabled people and retired people, like should they get extra or something like that. Then maybe I could see an argument for that. But generally speaking,
You consider like children to be disabled, sort of.
Right. Yeah. Well, just in the same way that old people,
Yeah.
like they can't work for money, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I guess that kind of makes sense. It's important to keep in mind that giving a basic income to children is really giving a basic income to their parents. Yeah. So Jay Gannon says, how to provide the maximum benefit. That is a socialist question. And who's to say what's best? Citizens' dividend is not socialist as it establishes ownership in a society. So, I mean, I think basic income is just giving people money. If you call it a citizens' dividend, then that kind of creates a moral framing of what the basic income is, that people are owners of the country and therefore that they deserve the payout. I think when we think about basic income in general, it's more about how do we have the most prosperous society? How do we achieve that? How do we get the best outcomes for people?
Yeah, and I would respectfully disagree with Jay Gannon that only socialists ask that kind of question. People in a lot of different schools of thought, including capitalism, are often asking the question, does this system align to create prosperity, to give benefit?
Right.
I think that's true. I think a proponent of any system many proponents of any system at least think that that's what's happening.
Andrew Yang with his freedom dividend says it establishes ownership of us in a society.
Yeah, so he kind of uses that framing too. Not a big fan of that framing. I think whether you're talking, basic income, citizens dividend, whatever you want to call it, it's it would be you wouldn't be getting the most out of it if you are limiting the payout based on thinking about what people deserve or what people own, if you're kind of framing it in that way. Yeah.
So somebody else might want to frame it that way, but in terms of giving people the most basic income and the most kind of benefits from society, you might not be doing that, which is kind of Alex's perspective.
Yeah. And in terms of whether it's a socialist question, I like to say that there are some resources that are most efficiently allocated directly by the government, and there are some resources that are most efficiently allocated by the market. And basic income funds the market. It's for the resources that are allocated by the market. So it's much more of a market-based thing than it is kind of a socialist thing. And socialism is, I guess there are a lot of different definitions of socialism, but it's more about kind of like collective ownership of the means of production, whereas basic income is giving people access to the means of consumption. It's giving people money so they can buy things in the market. There are some programs for which it makes sense for those programs to be socialized, like healthcare, infrastructure, military, that kind of stuff. But basic income is for everything else. It's for the market. Yeah.
Now, the Federal Reserve controls interest rates. And so you could ask, what is the best interest rate? Maybe that's a socialist question too.
That's interesting.
And if you think that that's the Federal Reserve is socialist, then I guess a inflation targeted UBI that is as big as it can be before inflation happens, would also be a socialist question.
Yeah.
But it's if central banking operations are socialist, then the UBI would be socialist.
And I think it's always true that you can't have a market without the institutions that create the framework in which the market exists. So you can't have a market if you don't have a currency that's managed by institutions, if you don't have
property rights that are
if you don't have property rights, if you don't like it's always a hybrid, right? So in some sense, the market itself, if you want to kind of take that broader view, the market itself is a socialist system, and then the government, you can also think of the government itself as a market system because it depends on the market and that kind of thing. So they're always kind of like feeding off each other.
Intermingling.
Yeah, it's a completely hybrid thing.
Did we have a discussion on this too? Maybe it wasn't socialism, but maybe it was like communism versus capitalism or something.
We had a discussion on socialism versus capitalism.
Last week.
That wasn't last week. That was earlier this year. Last week we had a discussion on capitalism being
Oh,
the
a
most
road to
efficient
communism.
road to communism, which is based on an article that was written by basic income supporter Philippe von Parijs back in the 1980s. So interesting stuff if you're interested in these questions. And then we had one on land value tax as well, and you're using the term citizens dividend. Land value tax, I think they usually call it citizens income, the Georgist people. But yeah. Okay, next quote. Pensions are regarded by most workers as among the most binding of all promises, a compact between themselves and their employers, sealed by years of labor. Americans assign government the responsibility for protecting this sacred compact from any temptation by companies to raid retirement accounts for their own purposes. Increasingly, though, this once unbreakable promise has become discretionary. Employers can abandon it when the stock market falters, when a firm goes through financial reorganization, or simply when shareholders demand higher profits. Insecurity is becoming the standard of older age in this country. So yeah, I mean, the fact that we're having this problem, I think, comes back to the idea that we're thinking about pensions in this way in the first place, as the most binding of all promises, that, you know, like that employers have a responsibility to provide for their employees' retirement. Like, this is not an efficient starting point. And, you know, the fact that this is breaking down, I think, is partly a result of the fact that these inefficiencies are creating tensions that are kind of reaching a breaking point.
A misaligned viewpoint in society.
Yeah.
It's also bringing up like this general idea of planning, and like it's really difficult. Like if you've been planning with one kind of expectation and then things change, and it's like this is a long-term planning process. You can't go back and change your whole planning at this point.
Yeah.
That's really bad for a lot of people. So I can see why he's highlighting this particular problem, where it was like thought of as to be very secure, and then that changed.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's a huge problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it kind of locks people in this thinking that, you know, that employers provide pensions for the workers has, you know, created this expectation that the government is going to enforce that employers provide pensions for workers, right?
Yeah. And I guess that's another example of like there's sort of reasons in here why the company isn't the best like organization to be providing it, because there's lots of other pressures to be profitable, and those kind of work against providing the pension, I guess, in some cases.
Yes.
So that's a problem.
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
In Russia, they're still the government, even though the communism collapsed, they're still paying the pensions from, the USSR days.
Really? Wow.
So why can't they do that with, these pensions? But then there's this, later on they mentioned this federal agency that
Pension Guarantee Company. Yeah.
That pays a fraction of it.
Yeah, I mean, like, so that's one answer, right? Is to kind of reinforce the strength of the pensions, and then the other answer is to say, wait a minute, pensions don't make sense. We can provide the benefit through something like a basic income, or even something like Social Security, which is kind of a form of pension, but it doesn't have to be. Social Security doesn't have to depend on, you know, what you put in. It could just be something that goes to everyone at the same level once they reach a certain age. Yeah.
I think. Yeah, I guess a couple of things this raises. One is like the transition, right? So if you're expecting a certain pension and then even transitioning to basic income, you have to be careful how you do the transition. So people aren't getting a lot less than they expected at first or something like that. And the same with Social Security. Like the only issue I can see, if you did it too abruptly, like if the same amount goes to everybody, there are sort of things you get locked into, at least in today's economy, based on sort of your cost of living, like your mortgage cost. And I think that's part of the reason that it's calibrated to your income over the course of your life, is so that you can kind of maintain living in the same location, living in the same house, that kind of thing. So there's some benefit to that to be thought of in this whole mix, I guess.
I think that's right. And I think, you know, the right way to transition into basic income is not to just have it replace everything automatically.
Right.
It's to gradually roll out the basic income and increase it until you kind of get to the maximum sustainable level, and then start thinking about, you know, how much are people depending on these other things? How do we transition to something more efficient that allows us to raise the basic income even further? That kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You want to be smart about all this stuff. You don't want to pull the rug out from under anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what they're talking about here, pulling the rug out from underneath people with the pensions.
Right.
Cool.
And it sucks, of course, that people were depending on this rug in the first place. It's kind of a crappy rug, but you still don't want to pull it out from under people. Yeah. Next quote.
Mm-hmm. There's no quote.
What was the quote here? It's probably this.
Probably the middle one.
Actually, sure. We'll just go with this one. Retirement insecurity is an increasingly serious manifestation of the vast inequality that is eating away the social fabric of America. I love the language in this thing.
Do you?
In a way, in a sense, I do. The same forces eroding pension rights are also leading to historic wage disparities, the uneven distribution of wealth, a hollowing out of the middle class, and the exacerbation of historic racial inequities. Roaring stock markets deepen inequality by driving increases of wealth to the top. Middle class equity is tied up in the housing market, which has gyrated in ways that have placed serious downward pressure on retirement savings for the majority.
So this is really interesting because it ties into what we're talking about with a lot of people investing in their houses versus the stock market.
Yes.
But is it really a long enough term thing that we can say that the stock market is much better at driving wealth than housing, or is that just kind of something happening at the moment that this?
The stock market has so far been historically consistent in going up and up and up and up.
And not
over
houses,
time.
though? Aren't houses also doing that? As a general trend?
Depends on the location.
Yeah, but as a general trend?
As a general trend, I think houses are also doing that. I think houses tend to be more investments of the middle class, and they're also investments of the upper class. Rich people invest in houses too. People investing in the stock market maybe starts a little bit higher.
But I'm saying, is one of them actually? This quote is saying that the stock market is a great way to make wealth right now, or in general, the last decade. I don't know what the time frame is, but housing is not. It seems to be the argument of this paragraph, right? Because they're saying like the middle class are invested in houses, and houses are not really helping you save for retirement as well as the stock market. That's what I'm reading from this paragraph. And I'm just wondering if that's factually true, because that wasn't necessarily my impression. Or are you reading something different from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're making a good point, and I think you're right. I don't know how important this distinction is. I think, generally speaking, poorer people have been more screwed over by investing in houses than by investing in the stock market.
Is that just because they're not investing in the stock market, though?
It's partly because they're not it's largely because they're not investing in the stock market, and the government has created more facilities for helping people buy houses, including poor people, than it has for helping people buy stocks or invest in stocks.
So I wonder if this paragraph has it a little off, because it says, I'm reading it again, and it says like middle class equity is tied up in houses, which has put downward pressure on retirement savings.
Right. So, and I think part of it also is that if you have a retirement, even like middle class people or poorer people, if they have retirement accounts, that's more something that can fluctuate over time, that they're not expecting to have access to that value right now. Whereas a home, a lot of times you maybe want to move and sell that house, but it gets a lot harder if you're underwater, or maybe you need a home equity loan or something like that. So it's more something you need to access now, even though it's also an investment for the future.
So should we read from this paragraph that he thinks it should just be easier for everybody to invest in the stock market? I guess I'm still trying to understand.
Oh, like what's the point that they're trying to make here? I think the main point that they're trying to make here is that we need to shore up. Let's see. I think they're saying that that pensions being less reliable is a microcosm of all these other problems in the economy that are creating more inequality, wealth disparities.
So maybe it's just
it's kind of like a laundry list.
I think the issue might just be that I didn't fully read the article. So presumably in the rest of it, he kind of fleshes out what he's talking about. But from this paragraph, I can't really figure out what he's talking about. Yeah. Like he says forces, but
it's not a he, it's a they, and they're both women.
They. The women say,
the women. We can just say the women.
Two women, these women. Yeah. I don't care about the gender, but my point is that the forces eroding the pensions, I'm saying, okay, what does he think these forces are? They're doing all these things. And then the only thing I can get from this paragraph is something about housing prices not going up as reliable as stock prices, which I'm not even sure is true.
Well, I'm looking at some empirical data. So since
Yeah.
the recent bottom of the stock market, which was also right after the housing,
Right.
since 2009,
Yeah.
The S&P 500 has basically, it's like almost quadrupled.
Okay.
It's like up 350%.
Yeah.
And housing prices are up maybe 40%.
I see. So that's
a pretty
relevant
big
to what he's
difference,
saying
yeah.
there. Yeah, that's
big
helpful.
difference.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So maybe he is saying that they're not going up at the same rate.
Yeah.
I don't know about the longer term trend. But
Yeah.
There's the
Right.
idea of like a sovereign wealth fund, but everyone gets a share of it, where if each company has to give like 10% of their stocks to it, and then people it's like a mutual fund, and everyone receives a dividend every quarter or something, right?
Yeah, this feels like this exercise again where in order to have an excuse to pay money out to people, you have to say, oh, but things were put in the past and it's an investment, it's a wealth fund or something like that. I feel like these are extra steps that are completely unnecessary. Yeah.
Do you want to go to the next?
So
Or,
I wanted
sorry,
to
you
get to
probably
some
had
of the
more stuff that you want to say.
well, just some of the stuff on the live stream. So my mom says, I think housing screwover is from the 2008 crash, but not before, right? I think that's largely true. I think if you look at why the 2008 crash happened, a lot of that has to do with the fact that monetary policy was too expansionary. It allowed people to buy houses. We created provisions that allowed people to buy houses because we wanted people to have houses, because we wanted people to be able to invest in houses and stuff like that. So certainly the mentality of housing should be an investment that everyone should have access to, and everyone should have a home because we want homes for people to live in, caused the kind of housing bubble. Like that's a big part of it, and people needing to kind of live near where the jobs are. We're driving up housing prices.
And rather low interest rates allow people to buy second and third and fourth or whatever.
Yeah, all this stuff, flipping homes and stuff like that. So the problem, the underlying problem was partly that we were thinking of homes as investments in the first place. So you brought up that post World War II investing in houses was fine. It depends what you mean by fine. Like the people who invested in houses, they had a stable investment, but it was also, playing into this whole thinking of housing as investments thing in the first place, which is maybe problematic.
Yeah.
If we give people more freedom to live in different places, provide them money in other ways, that allows us to create economic policies that make housing cheaper, like a basic income, for example.
So you could imagine that like the people, I'm going to be making this up a little bit, but the people who got in after World War II were really lucky because they, were sort of subsidized to be able to buy houses. But then the fact that they were all buying houses made houses for other people more expensive. And over time, that was sort of bad for other people who weren't in that first wave. So it looks like it was working then, it's not working now. But actually, the way that it was working then might be part of why it's not working now.
Yeah.
It might not have been sustainable.
They had built a lot of towns just for houses like Levittown.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just a thought that it could be related in that way.
No,
non-sustainable in that way.
It's a good thought, and I think you're basically right. And Jay Gannon says stock market is propped up by Fed money in order to save pensions and stay dominant. Mm-hmm. I think that's largely true too. If we didn't have this idea that pension funds need to be supported anymore, then we don't need a stock market that's constantly growing the way it is. And I think even an efficient stock market, you'd probably expect it to go up over time, but it's very much inflated now. Because there's all kinds of money that's just going into that. People are borrowing in order to buy stocks. That's a normal practice. Like to buy stocks on margin and to leverage and all of that.
That just happened in 1929.
Yeah, it's been happening for a long time, and we saw the crash in 2008, the crash in 1929. It doesn't need to be that way, right? If we provide people money directly through a basic income, that allows the Fed to tighten. It allows the stock market to, I guess you could say, crash, but come back down to a level that reflects that owning stocks is an investment in businesses that are actually productive for consumers. They're providing goods and services that actually benefit consumers.
Degrowth.
Yeah. Well, no, I wouldn't say degrowth, because degrowth is more like
degrow the stock market.
Degrowth of the stock market. Yeah. Exactly.
Rein in. I think people like to say it was a positive term.
Yeah. Yeah, and my mom brings up the issue of redlining. So this, when we talk about housing being good investments after World War II, I mean that's only for white people, pretty much. So there's all kinds of issues that go into expecting housing as being the stable thing for everyone. Yeah. All right. Next quote.
Do it.
Yeah. What another one? Do we have any of them or any of them
They all
highlighted?
went
Oh
away.
no, that's really sad.
But we can kind of guess.
I actually have them written down here as a backup, which quotes are.
Your system has worked until now.
I know, it's
I
the
know,
first
right?
time
Like I
ever.
said before,
Yeah.
Always scared.
But I do this
know.
as a backup
I
every
like I said
time.
last week.
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
take screenshots and then use paint
That's-
programs to draw.
That's a lot of extra work that I don't want to do.
But true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see which one. Do.
Or we can just do a PDF and draw lines around it.
Which one did we just do? Most binding of all promises. Which one was that one?
This one.
That's that one. So then this one.
Calling
So
it
it's
out
the one
a little
after.
last thing.
So then this one. In the United States. Wow. Where is it? In the... Here we go. In the United States, economic security in old age was seen for a long time as both a social issue and a national obligation. From the birth of Social Security to the end of the 20th century, the common assumption has been that we have a shared responsibility to secure a decent retirement for our citizens. Yet that notion is weakening rapidly. Instead, we have started to hear echoes of the mantra of self-reliance that characterized welfare reform in the 1990s. You alone are in charge of your retirement. If you wind up in poverty in your old age, you have only your own inability to plan, save, and invest to blame. Yeah. So, I mean, like, obviously, there's, we can address this by reinforcing pensions, or we can address this by having basic income. There's the way, I would say the most effective way to address this problem is not to go back to kind of this expectation that people save, and then this promise that the government will force your employer to save money for you or provide for your retirement and stuff like that, which is kind of what they're getting at in this article as the ideal. But the idea that you alone are in charge of your retirement, I think, is this kind of sentiment that we see in our politics, which I also think is a mistake. There's no reason why people should have to provide for themselves in retirement or at any other time, other than to provide an incentive for them to work. So if you have the incentives such that people are providing the necessary labor for the economy, you don't need it beyond that. You can have the government provide for people. That's not a problem. Yep.
What about your inability to plan, save, and invest?
We don't
have
need
that.
people to plan.
No, I know. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
wondering if really poor people, is it even a good idea for poor people to save for the future? Because they, by definition, they can't really afford to save. They can spend all that money now, and maybe it's better for the economy if they do spend it from the demand side and let the rich people spend it as investments from the production side.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. It doesn't always make sense to save for a lot of reasons. Not only for the economy, but as you said, they might not be able to afford it. And their needs in the present are certain. Their needs in the future are uncertain. They might not live that long. Other people might take the money from them if they try to save it. Not even like steal it from them, but there are family obligations, and other people who also have a lot of need around you often put, like, if you try to save, it's often really hard, I've heard, when you're really poor, because if your family and friends are also poor, then they will have reasons to need that money right away.
They can always do like a Wolf of
Yeah.
Wall Street type of thing.
Yeah.
They get cheated out of it.
Yeah,
They get cheated out of it, yeah.
if the economy can't sustain poor people spending all of the money they get, then I don't think the answer is to give them less money or give them the same amount of money and tell them to save some of it, right? I think the answer is, like if it can't sustain the spending, then, maybe you just make some calculation based on how much people are able to spend, and then you adjust how much money you give them, right? But yeah, I mean, like the fact that you saved money now for later doesn't mean there's more room in the economy to produce stuff for you later.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think a lot of this is rhetoric to justify policies that people want, kind of like
Right.
I think Phoenix was pointing out about different things before with like police officers. Like I think the rhetoric kind of follows behind the policies that people want. Like it doesn't really make sense. Like I don't think the people ending up in poverty in their old age, I'm guessing, I could be wrong, are generally the people that were doing really well financially the rest of their time and then they just like squandered it all. Like I doubt that's the predominance of who's ending up in poverty. Like,
So I think
probably people who didn't make enough money their whole time.
I think around the time of the Great Depression, it was a time when there were people who maybe they weren't wealthy, but they
Right.
worked their whole lives and had a decent life. And then the Depression hit,
That's
and then they
fair,
were
yeah.
poor in their old age.
Or
So that
yeah.
kind of was a thing.
Or
But
the
do you think-
stocks crashed and they lost all the money in the
Yeah.
stocks.
Do you think that's
Right.
what's happening now, though? Like, I guess I was speaking more to contemporary situations.
Do I think that's what's happening now? I think generally speaking, the wealthy people are fine in retirement. Yeah.
I mean, that was my general impression. But
I think it is true that to middle class people,
Mm.
if they didn't get Social Security, they might be in trouble when they retire.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's true.
without
yeah.
Social Security.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's fair. I guess I'm just agreeing that like this rhetoric doesn't really seem like it's grounded in the effort to really understand the problem so much as like maybe people want lower taxes or something. That's
Yeah.
where I'm guessing some of this rhetoric is coming from.
Right. And I think, if you separate the idea of taxation from government spending, then that makes it a little bit easier to talk to people about some of these issues if they're afraid of taxes, that kind of thing. I like the assumption that we have a shared responsibility to secure a decent retirement for our citizens. I would expand that to say we have a shared responsibility to ensure a prosperous life for all of our citizens. Ensure, to the extent that our economy has the resources to provide this, the responsibility of our institutions is to ensure that people get that benefit, that they have a good life. And that's, that's basic income. Basic income ensures that. Also, providing the social services that we need to provide. All of that combined, there is a shared responsibility, and the government represents that responsibility. It's not, about private employers, and we've made it about private employers in our culture. I think there's this sense that the government's money is limited. And they can't just create money. And as a result of us having this kind of intuition that things work this way, what we've done is we've caused the private sector to print a ton of money, and then it gets distributed really inefficiently, and results in kind of this instability that leads to.
They have the idea that it's like running like a household or a business where you can't, create your own money. You have to pay massive interest rates, like 28% or whatever on it.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I think there's when the private sector is printing all this money, our culture, we tend not to think of it as printing money, as we would if the government were running massive deficits or something like that. But it's really, in terms of money creation, it's comparable. The difference is that if you do it in the private financial sector, it's really unstable. And then you get, this buildup of private credit, and then it collapses. And we're kind of using this mechanism, fueling these asset bubbles by keeping money really cheap in the private sector to fund a lot of our stuff. And I think in order to really, I think people are afraid of having the government support people directly, because they think it has to come from taxes. And they're afraid of deficit spending. So then that's part of the reason why we push it onto the private sector employers, stuff like that. Yeah.
And interestingly, onto like this idea of like the stock, like if you have pensions and then they're in the stock market and then you're propping up the stock market, you're like kind of printing money that way.
Right.
And so you do it that way instead of giving people the money as government money.
And there's this idea that if you're making an investment, you're taking some initial money and then you're growing it through something that's productive, and it's like you planted a seed and then you're reaping the
Getting
reward
the tree,
at the end or something like that. It's like, well,
that's the idea.
Okay.
In other meetups, I guess we've talked about how currently sometimes it's not always so efficient. Or like it's not always going towards something so tangible.
And I think in a market where investment is efficient and people are only investing in, businesses and firms that are building out real capacity to provide stuff for consumers, that intuition is true. In the same sense that if we have an efficient labor market, then, jobs actually are productive because they only exist because we want the output of the labor. Then it's true there as well. But to the extent that we make it easier for people to invest, stimulate the financial sector, now to the extent that we're doing that, the investments are no longer producing something that's beneficial to the economy. They're just an excuse to give people more money later.
BS jobs and create zombie companies.
Right. So the financial sector over stimulus is very much intertwined with overstimulating the labor market, creating jobs, for people just for the purpose of providing them money. So there's this aversion to doing things directly through the government. Instead, the government still does it, but they do it indirectly through the private financial sector and the labor market, and that causes all kinds of problems. Yeah, and that's true for retirement. It's true for everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, your mom made a good point that, like, similar to the Depression, there was like the people who happened to be retiring around the 2008 crash were pretty screwed as well.
True that people who lost savings and investment ended up poor, way less well off.
Yeah, in the 2008.
Yeah, old people can't wait for the market to recover.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So then
That's
that's also a problem with the market being part of how you're like.
But it's also true that at least historically, if you bought stocks when the market was at a peak and then you sold, and then decades later you sold all your stocks when the market was at a trough, that would be a decent retirement. It wasn't, obviously it's worse than if you had sold the stocks right before it crashed, but it's still like over the long run, it's been enough. Right.
And I think this is another advantage of like stock market over houses, or like another issue with houses, is that like with the stock market, I think you can gradually take money out as you reach retirement. You move it to safer investments and then you move it to savings, like gradually to kind of mitigate some of this risk. But with your house, like I don't know of a similar system because it's all in one thing. You sell it or you don't.
Well, you can borrow against it. I mean,
you can borrow against it, yeah. So maybe there's ways to do that.
Where you receive a payment every month for the next 30 years.
Right. So if you set that up ahead of time.
Yeah. So maybe there's some.
Obviously, you can't borrow against your house if you're underwater on your mortgage.
Right.
Yeah. But I think there is some of what you're talking about as well.
Maybe I'm just not as aware of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or people might not know to do it that often, like your mom was pointing out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Jay Gannon says, we are just getting the metaphysics in order right now. The metaphysics. Do we want to be authoritarian or liberty-based? Once we understand that liberty is superior, we will be able to move forward with UBI. Is it about that? Is it about understanding that liberty is better? I think it's a little bit simpler. I think it's once people understand that we can actually give everyone money, give everyone free money, and everything will be okay, if not better, it'll be better. Then people will be like, yeah, okay, great. Like for me, when I first started thinking about UBI, I realized before I'd ever heard of the term basic income or UBI or anything like that, I was just thinking about the economy and I was like, wait a minute, we can actually give everybody free money. This is something that's possible that we could actually do. The economy has room for that. So then I was like, okay, what are the implications of this? And then I started learning, there are people talking about basic income, that kind of stuff. But I think once people have that understanding that it's something that's actually possible, it's less about, being authoritarian or liberty-based or something like that. It's like, oh man, we can give everyone free money and that makes everyone better off. This is why shouldn't we do this, right? Yeah.
Also, when one country, implements a UBI, then other people may follow the trend, and then government debt will, be pointless, and no one will really care about it anymore.
I think that's right. I think if there's a country that implements a basic income and everyone just sees how how well it works and how effective it is on promoting prosperity in their citizens, there's no reason why other countries would decide to hold back from doing that. Yeah, that's a great point, Richard. Okay, next quote. And we're going to look it up on the phone again because of reasons. Which one did we do? In the United States. So now we're doing... Wow, it lost my place too.
Maybe just do little searches and find the different.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
While you're looking, I might mention that another question is, do people need an authoritarian, or given maximum liberty, will they know what to do with themselves? Which might seem obvious that people would like liberty, except that some people who complain about UBI say that people need jobs, they need a guaranteed job because they really don't know what else to do with themselves, and they'll just hang out on the street corner unless somebody tells them what to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point where that comes in. Yeah.
So some authority that's providing a structure for people.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a good point, and I think to some extent some people would benefit from having that.
But I think you generally like take for granted that freedom is better for the most part, and so that's part of what's in your mind when you think about UBI.
Yeah. So I mean, I think by default, you want people to be able to spend their time how they choose, but some people need some kind of structure or something like that. So maybe you provide that service. So you start with the default of freedom; everyone can just do whatever they want, and then figure out what kinds of things would benefit people and provide those opportunities for people. That structure for the people who need it. Yeah, I think that's right. Let's see. So this one. We must ensure that workers who have spent decades saving for retirement through pension contributions based on promises made to them by their employers can rely on those commitments. Companies that go bankrupt should not be able to put their shareholders first and their employees last when debts are settled. So, yeah, I mean, this is kind of like a moral framing, like put the workers first, that kind of thing. I think it's less that we must ensure workers who have put in all this stuff have a decent retirement. It's why not just ensure that everyone can, doesn't have to work and is able to.
But I mean, if we were looking at this local question, like not assuming outside options like UBI, just like how should things happen? Like who gets paid first, like the pensions or the the bondholders or something. I mean, I think that's an interesting question.
There's actually something called primary stock or something like that, and then there's common stock, and the primary stock receives their share before anything else happens, and that's what a lot of the wealthy buy.
Right.
And the primary stock doesn't get to vote, whereas the common stock does, which is interesting too.
That's interesting.
But I mean, I thought that if you're bankrupt, that means that's the situation where the shareholders aren't getting anything. But the company might have other creditors.
Yeah.
Usually what happens is you pay the debt holders first, the bondholders.
Right.
Yeah. And then if there's anything left over, you might pay the shareholders. So maybe the issue here is that it's often set up to pay the shareholders before you pay the pensions or something like that.
Seems wrong.
I would have assumed that pensions were earlier than the shareholders.
You'd think pensions.
It's a kind of debt.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe that's one of the things that's changed. I don't really know the rules or laws around pensions.
Yeah.
This article seems to be implying that they've become less of a commitment legally, but I don't know the details.
And I think it's tricky when you have contracts and agreements like this where one side is not able to fulfill that agreement. So I mean, to the extent that you can make a difference here by saying, workers need to get paid first, or they need to be provided security first. I feel like that this is a minor tweak, and it makes sense if you're still thinking in terms of like employers need to be providing all this stuff. But
also it's like, I mean, if you're not thinking about, like I said, the big picture or there are other options, and you were just in charge of like making this rule, then you'd be thinking about like social welfare implications, big picture, and locally, and of the different orders that people could be paid and how it would affect things.
Right. And Phoenix Congress says, how does this quote apply to public pensions, where unions have negotiated unrealistic pensions and the city/state can't create money to cover them.
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah.
My grandmother lived in a city like that, and she worked for the government for like 30 years. The city, and they set the amount, and then they didn't raise it for like 20 years or whatever. So there wasn't any inflation or anything like that, and that's how they managed the.
That's how they did it. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I think Phoenix Congress, you're calling attention to some things that are problematic with managing all of this stuff through pensions in the first place.
Yeah. Including, like you said, like how it gets influenced by the bargaining process that affects the amount, and then whether it's the city can handle it, like you said, if they're responsible, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
So I mean, I think if you're the people writing this article and you want to fix this thing, I mean, like, so cities and states don't have shareholders that they're paying, so it's impossible for them to say, oh, you need to pay the pensioners first, right? It's all cities and states have debt, and they have other obligations. So I think this quote applies less because you don't have this choice of who to pay first as much. You could say maybe people's pensions have to be paid first before the debt that's owed to contractors or something like that, or owed to municipal bondholders or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's
Or
different.
you like Puerto Rico, you have to pay the bondholders first before you do anything else.
It's tricky too because a lot of these bonds are being held by pension funds, so it's not exactly as simple as saying pay the pensioners before you pay the bondholders.
Yeah. That's complicated too. Right.
I think all of this is just calling attention to the fact that managing people's retirements through pensions and investments is not the right way to go. And Phoenix says they have debt and taxpayers
Instead of shareholders, maybe. I think maybe.
instead of shareholders, they have taxpayers. Yeah.
Thanks, Jay Gannon.
Thanks, Jay Gannon. Thanks for your questions and comments. So yeah, they have debt and taxpayers. I like to say that governments don't represent taxpayers; they represent citizens. And I think a lot of times we kind of like think about the morality of like, I paid taxes. The government is spending my money, therefore they should do blah blah blah. But like, the government represents all citizens, regardless of how many taxes they happen to be paying, and that kind of thing. I also don't like thinking of when the government spends money that they're spending taxpayer dollars. Of course, this is more true at the level of the city or the state, that they have to collect revenue, or they have to borrow in order to spend. They have to get people to give them money in order to spend money. Yeah.
But the way that our government's set up is that businesses are considered people, and and the businesses are like the most important people to the corrupt government as it is right now.
I think to some extent that's true. There are some ways in which the law treats businesses as people.
It's actually a Supreme Court case in the 1870s.
Yeah, I mean, there are some ways in which corporations are not people. They don't get to vote. There's all kinds of ways in which corporations are not people. There are certain contexts in which they're treated as equivalent.
They can't get married to each other.
They can't get married to each other.
That's what mergers are, though.
Yeah, well, kind of different law though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't get locked up in prison.
They can't go to prison. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
They can get fined or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the main thing about corporations is that they are their own tax entities, and if they have liabilities, then the liabilities don't get passed on to the individual people within the corporation. Yeah. Okay. Next quote.
Yeah.
Or you guys can keep talking while
you find the next quote.
It's
funny. It draws attention to how well it's worked every other time.
I know,
Nick
right?
was saying, like, it's the first time.
I'm always nervous.
Yeah.
You're always nervous?
Well, just
Yeah. Okay, so here we go. The fiduciary responsibilities of banks and brokerage houses that supervise the investment portfolios of pension funds must be elevated, and the supervision over them by federal regulators must be made more robust. So I think this is just kind of a backwards way of saying the government needs to take more responsibility over taking care of people. And I don't think the right way to do it is to kind of strengthen the backstops against, banks and brokerage houses that supervise investment portfolios, I think the right way to do it is to do it directly through the government.
And the thing about, backing up the fiduciary houses or whatever is it incentivizes them to go bankrupt or whatever in the first place, so they can
moral
receive
hazard.
Creates a moral hazard. Yep.
Good point.
Anyone have any more thoughts on that?
No, I'm kind of like excited to get through these quotes now.
All right, we got the next quote here. Wow. At the same time, the rules governing 401k plans need to be tightened so that retirement money becomes an investment that cannot be touched until retirement. In times of economic hardship, many workers feel they have no choice but to tap into these savings early. If we had more substantial and generous unemployment insurance, invested more in retraining, and provided more generously for medical needs, it would be much more feasible to create retirement funds that wouldn't need to be raided early by families in distress.
It kind of seems like, again, this is a very specific way of thinking about like a broader thing, which is like kind of what Steve was pointing out. Like if you have more excess money, you can save it for the future. That's kind of like the spirit of what's behind this.
Right.
Because his point is like people can't afford to keep the money saved. They need it now. And so we need to like allow people to have more excess money to save, basically.
Right. So it's just reinforcing kind of this status quo way of thinking about retirement saving.
But I do like that he's getting at this point that Steve was getting at a little bit, which is that people need to have excess money somehow and they don't have it. Like it's going to these different things, like unemployment periods or medical expenses and stuff.
Yeah. Whenever I read a paragraph like that starts listing off all these programs.
Right.
Tiny little fractions of the solution.
I know.
This is what makes my mind jump to UBI.
Yeah. Why not just money, which is what people need. Yeah, these are all like more constrained ways of giving people money, and they might not cover the particular thing that somebody has.
And especially, and solutions are like more regulations. Of the financial industry. Those guys are famous for being able to
get around regulations.
It also creates bureaucracy that costs a lot of money that we could use to fund the UBI.
Right.
Like some articles say, UBI, at the top they say UBI is obviously crazy, we can solve this some other way. And then it's government money, until it's probably added up to $1,000 a month.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Phoenix Congress says Yang talks repeatedly about how the outcomes from retraining aren't that great.
I noticed that too.
That close to no one actually gets a new job from it.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And I mean that's true, but it's also true that the idea that retraining is part of the solution comes from this idea that people have to earn money from a job in the first place, which is not, even if retraining kind of worked, it still wouldn't be the answer.
Yeah, but I also noticed that because it kind of makes me feel like this, like many articles, there's just kind of like these talking points in a way.
Right.
And people aren't really investigating whether they work, which we happen to know because Andrew Yang's pointed this out from retraining. But maybe a lot of what requires people to draw from their plans isn't covered by any of these different things on the list.
Yes.
Anyway, I noticed that too.
Andrew Yang says the type of retraining that works is that companies retrain people to work on the things that they actually want them to work on.
Right.
Yes.
That makes sense.
And the people who are being retrained or trained are the people who want to do those jobs. Right. If you just force someone into a retraining program, that's not efficient.
Like they create a special a fly-by-night school and will retrain you for something that no one actually wants to do, and and then no one wants to hire them after that.
I mean that's a good point. Like with the retraining, why isn't the company already training people to do it? Like presumably, if there was a strong need for it, then maybe it would be.
But
in a lot of
cases. The issue with that is that they'll think that they'll go to our competitor instead, and so there's no incentive for them to trade. That's the private market. Private argument.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. Yeah, that's a good point.
So here's the next one. More of the same. Finally, to add to our list, we must shore up the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency charged with ensuring private retirement plans, since it is the only backstop for those that go bankrupt and will soon be out of business if we don't. even though the PBGC provides only partial coverage for benefits, it remains a vital means of protecting at least some of the pension money that workers depend on. If it goes belly up, there will be nothing left for them to fall back on. So same criticisms as before. If you're providing these kinds of backstops to private retirement plans or private anything, then what you're doing is you're indirectly making it a public thing. So you can just skip this whole process and make it a public thing.
And there's also the moral hazard if you make all these really generous programs and just to end the strike or whatever, then you could just go belly up or whatever, and then you don't have to go for it because the government will pay for it anyway.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, if you're going to have welfare for pension funds, you might as well just have welfare.
Right.
Yes, that is exactly right.
And then you don't leave as many people out, too.
Right. You guys ready for the next one? Mm-hmm. Beyond these protections for private retirement accounts, the most universal of retirement plans, Social Security needs to be more robustly funded. Eliminating the earnings cap and requiring high-income employees to pay a Social Security tax on all of their earnings is a vital first step, and it may well be the only one needed to ensure that this basic support system can function well into the future. Needless to say, the wealthy would hardly feel it if they were required to pay the same tax on their earnings that people with far less income routinely pay now.
What does that mean?
So there's a certain level of income above which you do not have to pay additional Social Security taxes.
Yeah, it says that in there it's like $146,000 or something like that.
Oh, wow.
Something like that,
That's
yeah.
pretty high.
So, meh.
It's kind of like the opposite of how other taxes work.
But they would notice like 33% of their income is disappearing to Social Security.
Yeah, they would notice that. I don't know if we need any taxes associated with Social Security. I mean, what matters is whether giving people the money, overly taxes the economy's resources to the extent that we get inflation or something like that.
It's also funny, the Social Security tax thing in particular, because you could be saying like we should just raise general taxes in some way and use it to pay for Social Security, but we have this idea that's not really actually how it works, I think, but there's this idea that like the money you pay in is kind of the money that you get out, but it's not really how it works.
In terms of how they do the accounting for Social Security, it is kind of this separate set-aside fund.
Is it really? Okay.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
I didn't know that it
we could just take
was.
It from the general fund. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Right. I didn't know they actually did.
Yeah, it's legally structured that way.
That's interesting.
But we could change that.
Right.
We're not going to stop paying out Social Security. Social Security is not in danger of anything because we can always change the rules and say, okay, we're still going to pay it out.
Yeah.
Right.
The way how it's been is just like an inverted pyramid. There are fewer and fewer people paying into it anyway.
Right. And like people say like, oh no, the sky is falling. We're going to run out of money for Social Security. But really it doesn't matter. Like none of that is a problem. The inverted pyramid is, like, whatever. We can pay people money. We've been doing it. We can keep doing it. It's not a problem.
Or like Richard pointed out at the beginning, nobody was paying into it, and they were paying it out anyway.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So we can have that again.
Well, Social Security is not an insurance plan, according to my definition, because an insurance plan is a hedged bet.
Right.
In life insurance, if you die early, you lose, but as far as the money, you win, because you get your $100,000 of life insurance, term life insurance. Social Security does not work that way. If you die early, you don't get all the money. You will stop getting any money, more or less. Whereas if you live to 100, you win, and then you win the money also, because you've been getting Social Security until you're 100. Way much more than you ever put in. So it would have to be completely shuffled around to be an actual insurance program.
Right. It's not really insurance, like you said. It's more like forced saving, I think, because it's like you kind of know what you're going to get. It's not like dependent on. Yeah. Well, I guess like you said, you get more if you live longer.
Well, life insurance is if you end up in the unfortunate situation of being dead, we will pay you.
Right.
Social Security is if you end up in the unfortunate situation of still being alive, we will pay you.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but it's fortunate, right. But I mean, it's not about like risk management, right? Exactly. It's not like it helps you if you have an unexpected expense. I mean, I guess kind of.
You're unexpectedly still alive. That's the risk.
Longer.
You're risking being alive longer, right?
Right.
So in a sense, you could kind of frame it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now everybody could just do their own savings, except to sort of flatten out life's catastrophes, you want to pool. I think an insurance fund pools the money so that there's enough to cover your unexpected catastrophe.
Yeah.
Right.
Even if you didn't happen to save enough for it.
Yeah.
You made a
Right.
deal with this pool. So, you pay in your car insurance
Yeah.
premium, and then you actually have a catastrophic accident. So you lose. You caused a big accident. But then as far as the money goes, you win.
Yeah.
You actually get, a $500,000 of
Right.
from your insurance company.
Right. That makes sense.
So that's where you've hedged the bet.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Social Security doesn't work that way.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Well, I don't know. I think it does work that way a little bit, just to push back, because you're putting a certain amount in, and then the idea is that for the people who die early, they're subsidizing the people who die later. So
I guess the unexpected expense would just be that you live
You're
for
still
a really
alive,
long time,
yeah.
which we think of as good, but it's still an unexpected expense, I guess.
yeah,
So the 100-year-old win-win
Yeah.
people
right.
are subsidized by the lose-lose.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
you'd rather it was
Yeah.
the other way around.
I don't know if you'd rather it was the other way around. Do you want the people who are alive to be receiving the
You'd
benefit?
like everybody to win and lose or lose and win. Because that's how it works in regular.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I guess that's a good
hedged
point.
bet like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So here's the next one.
Us being alive till 100 is a real drag.
Well, if you throw in medical care, you could live to 100, but you had a lot of medical problems all along the way. So not only did you use huge income, but you used huge Medicare,
Yeah.
way more, twice as much as way more than you ever put in. Now,
Although if you
would
made
be-
it to 100, maybe you didn't have that many problems along the
yeah,
way.
it would be,
I'm thinking of my
Yeah.
grandmother who's 99, and she didn't use much medical care
yeah.
because that's how she made it
It
there.
would actually be convenient, actuarially convenient, if
Right.
people sort of had a constant number of catastrophic medical problems, no matter when they died.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
you always have, 3 big hospital stays,
Yeah.
no matter when you
It'd
die.
be easier to
So,
predict.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway. This
So
one's
here's the
interesting,
next
yeah.
one. The very concept of retirement is fading away, replaced by a work life that does not end at the traditional age of 65. As private pensions, Social Security, and Medicare become increasingly inadequate for meeting basic needs, the working life simply has to go on. That may not be a problem for those who are well educated and work in rewarding, well-paying professions that do not tax the body. But it is not a solution for people who can no longer stand for hours, lift heavy objects, move at a rapid pace, or master new technologies that require an education they don't have. For these people, the obligation to work longer and longer is a recipe for stress and downward mobility. The fact that the fastest growing sector of American labor consists of full-time workers over the age of 65 tells us how bad the problem of retirement insecurity has gotten.
It's pretty interesting. I didn't
Yeah.
know that was true, the largest.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems right.
So I like the idea of the concept of retirement fading away, but I don't like that, it goes along with this idea that everyone has to keep working. But I think it would be fantastic if we don't think of people as retired or retiring, but we think of the people who are working as like, these are the people who happen to be choosing to work right now.
Do a lot of
Yeah.
people, I guess not everybody, but do some of the people end up on disability then? Because I know disability in some communities where all the jobs involve standing is a lot more common than in other
Yes.
communities where jobs involve sitting. So I could imagine that part of what's happening is a de facto attempt at a small basic income via disability for some of these people.
Yep. It's like basic income, but far less efficient.
Yeah,
And
right.
not everyone who needs it gets it and that kind
yeah,
of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Last
Yeah.
quote, we almost made it.
Last quote. All right. Where is it? All right. Do the search. There we go. We have to start looking in the right direction for solutions. And we must ensure that we do not rob other deserving populations, especially children, in whom we invest a paltry sum relative to other advanced post-industrial societies, to solve the inequalities that beset the retirement system in the wealthiest country in the world. I think we have to start looking in the right direction for solutions. I think this article is looking in the wrong direction.
We should look in the wrong direction.
Yeah. The right direction for solutions is to look more towards something like basic income and to stop thinking of people as workers by default, and that they have to like contribute a certain amount over their life and then they get to take a break at the end. Like that is not a healthy way to think of human people.
But it's good that he's thinking about opportunity cost here at the end too.
Yeah. So let's get final thoughts from people. Bethany.
Yep, this is super interesting. I feel like we touched on most of the topics that I wanted to touch on with retirement.
Okay. Steve.
I remember that in the 80s, when the Japanese companies were ruling the world, they would make these 500-year economic plans.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
And, of course, all those companies, they went out of business in the next 10 years or something like that.
Yeah.
But in this article, talking about all these, 100-year or perpetual retirement schemes, pension schemes.
Yeah.
It's like a 500-year business plan. It's just ridiculous.
Hard
I don't
to
know why
plan.
we even bothered, why a corporation would bother
Right.
to figure out how they're going to pay pensions forever.
Yeah, that's a good point. Not realistic.
Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I thought this article sort of correctly identified a lot of the things that they said were bad problems. I think I agree are bad problems.
Yeah.
And that makes me happy that we talked about it. I think it's maybe it's a good way to, like a good topic to help people see what a elegant solution it would be.
Yeah.
Just give people basic income.
Right.
It could solve all these bad problems.
Yeah.
Good point.
Richard.
Well, this article argues for more bureaucracies and regulations and things, while those things would cost a lot of money, and you can just use that money to at least partially pay for a basic income, which would, solve those issues in the first place. And you don't need complicated things to solve complicated problems. You can have a simple thing to solve a complicated problem.
Yeah. I really liked Steve's anecdote about the 500-year plans. And I think the same thing applies to the government. There are certain things we should be planning for, like investing in infrastructure and, like making sure things are generally going in the right direction. But in terms of providing monetary benefit to people, the question is, how much money can we provide people right now? What resources do we have available to benefit people? Maybe we want to plan and conserve some of those resources for the future, that kind of thing. But really, it's not about like, how do we set aside money now so that we have money in the future? I think, we can look at what's available to our aging population now and provide that to our entire population. And that's, more in line with kind of how basic income works. It's about maximizing what we can do now, and then into the future, we'll keep maximizing whatever it is we will be able to do then. And ideally, as we build the economy and develop technology and become more productive, that benefit is going to increase. And that's I think the right approach to these kinds of things. The pension thing feels a little bit absurd, and we see it coming apart now. Like the Japanese companies maybe failed in 10 years, but these pension plans that we've been planning for decades, they fell apart too. It's not the right way to go about preparing ourselves for the future.
And saving money props up the companies with like zombie companies and things anyway. So if we don't need to save money, these companies might collapse. And
yeah, that's true. We won't have an incentive to keep the stock market going up, keep the money markets and the bonds going up and that kind of thing. My mom says, I don't think you can get both Social Security and disability.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that.
What?
That's from my earlier comment about whether disability was picking up some of the slack for people over 65.
Oh.
But it sounds like not necessarily, because they're already eligible for Social Security.
I see.
I hadn't thought about that.
So great discussion, guys. Next week, we're going to be on Monday, and we're going to be talking about this Thursday's Democratic presidential primary debate. So it's down to 7 candidates. We're going to hear, more from each individual candidate, and that hopefully includes Andrew Yang. And he's in the debate, but hopefully he'll get more time to talk. So yeah, it should be an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
The debate is on. It was being held up by a labor dispute, but they've resolved that dispute. Maybe there'll be some questions about that during the debate. We'll find out. Yeah.
Cool. That's on Monday, you said?
On Monday the 23rd.